Thank you. It's great to be here in beautiful Georgia again, my second home as I call it. I was just here several months ago for the theological conference with Anthony, where I had a wonderful time presenting on the fourth gospel and participating in some great dialogue and conversation with some really brilliant people. And I'm honored here today to be with still more brilliant people like yourselves. It's been great getting to know you. If I haven't made my way around to meet all of you yet, then I will. But I want to start by thanking Jan Stilson for inviting me here to be with you today. Jan, as you know, is a really wonderful woman who's done some terrific work for the conference. Last year, she gave me a copy of her encyclopedia, which I was very blessed by. And it gave me an opportunity to get in touch with the rich background of the conference. I wasn't born in the Church of God. My history with the conference does not go back very far, I'm sorry to say. But I've been in touch with the Church of God for about 4 or 5 years now. And I guess if there's any place that I can get acquainted with all of the good that the Church of God has done over the past century, then this is the place to do it. So very happy to be here. I understand that this annual gathering has done a lot to share in and to preserve the history of the conference, but also of the biblical Unitarian faith in general. So when Jan invited me to participate, I knew this was something I could participate in, at least on the more ancient side of this faith's history. And so for my part today, we're going to be reviewing, on the one hand, the history of biblical Unitarianism leading up to the 4th century. And then from the 4th century, we'll be getting to know Photinus of Galatia and seeing what the record of his life might have to say about our present times. But first, a little bit about history in general. Recently, I've been reflecting on the nature of history, what it is, how we get it, and ultimately its value. And it's occurred to me that just as for a tree, there is no more vital system than its roots, history for any group of people provides the same vital structure. And this is one reason why doing history is so important to us as a community. Yes, doing history can be entertaining, stimulating, but it's also a lifeline to an earlier and perhaps more pure era, or at least a window into a world in which we can locate our present challenges and perhaps more clearer answers to them. And so the value of the work that each of you do at this conference every year cannot be overstated. In my own small church in Houston, we often take the time to remember those who came before us. We've done small series on the lives of Unitarian Christians of the past, from both before and after the Reformation. Not only in order to become acquainted with these heroes, but more specifically with the problems that they faced in their own lifetimes. It's so easy in a land like America to lose sight of just how precious our freedoms are. Those of us at this conference may have had a taste of what it's like to be rejected socially. We may have faced some social pressure to conform religiously. But the vast majority of Christians in America have not experienced a bodily persecution. We have not been forced to choose between the teachings of Jesus and painful death. And herein lies the great value in studying Unitarians of the past. It reminds us of the value of our present way of life. It encourages us to not take the time and the knowledge that we have for granted. And it encourages us to use these gifts wisely in the world today. And we have been made custodians of the faith. Amen. The apostles wrote that we should take care of the faith once delivered to the saints. But we have also been made custodians of the history of the faithful. Indeed, if we are not going to care for this history, to preserve it and to make it known, to use it and to learn from it, then who will? Without doubt, church history has been mishandled by the present majority in Christianity. Evangelicals, Catholics, and others who maintain the so-called orthodox theological traditions have inherited and promoted a largely manufactured history created by the Catholic Church and the Roman government. And it is this whitewashed account of early Christian history which sadly directly fuels the social stigmas of our present time. Christians today are rejected from communities under the assumption that they do not hold to what the church has always and universally believed, or on the assumption that what a Unitarian claims today is a recent innovation. If we are ever to engage in meaningful dialogue with other Christians about Unitarianism, the artificial boundary lines of Catholic history, of historical orthodoxy and heresy must be challenged, and challenged publicly and repeatedly. In my recent years engaging with Christians about their religious history, one thing has become all too clear, and that is that church history in general is not paid much mind in evangelical circles today. Is this an accident? I've often asked myself. Or is history one of the great weaknesses of the Orthodox superstructure? As theologian David Strauss once said, the true criticism of dogma is its history. Indeed, a careful analysis of the developmental history of Orthodox dogma is what the present majority hopes to avoid, or should hope to avoid, as an unfiltered analysis can only reveal that the official story that the Church has always been Trinitarian is in fact a ruse. And it is fair to say, I believe, that the history served to the Christian masses today, if it is ever served at all, is largely artificial and only the end result of a successful campaign to sterilize the difficult career of Trinitarianism. Under the reign of such tyrannical figures as the violent 4th century Emperor Theodosius I, Christian history was essentially revised to conform to a manufactured religious unity that was forced on the Roman Empire. In the 4th century, once the Trinitarian dogma was finally set down and enforced at the point of a sword, every Unitarian book, every memory of every Unitarian figure, along with other expressions of Christianity, was threatened. Most were effectively dissolved, many to the ends that we have only very little information about them today. And it is providential, I think, that anything Unitarian did survive the fires of the 4th century church. And the topic that we will review today certainly provides us with even more reason to doubt the official story of orthodoxy, and even now provides us, I believe, with insight, encouragement, and perhaps even a little hope. Today we will have the privilege of being introduced to one Unitarian Christian of the 4th century who will provide us with a wonderful picture of courage and conviction, and who will serve to further dismantle modern misconceptions about our history. It is so often said that the Unitarian faith, specifically the Socinian or Biblical Unitarian Christology that we entertain today, is only the product of the Age of Enlightenment. In other words, that it is a recent innovation. But examining the life and times of Photinus of Galatia will quickly put that idea to rest. As we will see, in the 4th century, Photinus was teaching that God is one, that He is the Father of Jesus, and that Jesus of Nazareth was a human being who did not literally pre-exist His birth and was miraculously born of a virgin. This is, of course, the basic teaching of biblical Unitarians today, and studying the life and times of Photinus and the Christological tradition which he carried on should thus prove useful to us in better establishing our own place in church history. Okay, 4th century. Now, the exact year of Photinus' birth is unknown to us. We might be safe to assume, however, that it lies somewhere in the vicinity of the Council of Nicaea in 325. Nicaea was at least an event which paints for us the dramatic and political and religious world into which Photinus was born. And we must take some time to consider that world before we can consider the man within it. In the years preceding Nicaea, things had already been rapidly changing in the Roman Empire. The Emperor Constantine had recently turned his favor towards Christianity, a pitiable and regularly persecuted religion founded by peasant Jews, though one beginning to gain some ground among some Roman Neoplatonists. The theories surrounding Constantine's purported conversion to the Christian faith have been legion. In my own recent book, The God of Jesus in Light of Christian Dogma, I recently looked to Constantine's involvement with the monotheistic Sol Invictus and Hermetic cults and pointed out that monotheism was already being valued by him as not only a religious idea, but perhaps as a means of consolidating both religious and political power in his kingdom. Regardless, the reforging of Rome as a Christian empire was indeed, first and foremost, a highly political endeavor. The church, which slowly formed under the generous sponsorship of the state, had already inherited an impressive political skeleton from her secular guardian. Just as each province had its own governor answerable to the emperor, so the church's districts had their bishops. As long as each district was governed by a single bishop, matters both political and doctrinal could be controlled. It was, in fact, the threat of a loss of theological control in the bishopric of Alexandria which sparked the Nicene Council in the first place. Arius, a presbyter from Baucalis, had disagreed with the theology of his bishop Alexander, as is well known. Arius was branded an innovator. He had subordinated the Son to the Father, and he had declared that there was a time when the Son was not. This contravened with Alexander, and perhaps more importantly with his fiery young deacon Athanasius, who, working from a modified Origenism, claimed that the Son was eternally generated. But against accusations from his bishop, Arius defended his own doctrine as traditional. But who was right? Was Arius an innovator, or was he a theological conservative? What about Photinus, who lived and taught some years later and said similar things as Arius about God and Jesus? To answer this basic question of innovation, we must travel centuries backwards and work our way back up to the 4th century. And it seems right to begin this brief survey in Palestine with the Jewish Christians. What did they believe about God and Jesus? In the 1st century CE, in the years after the conclusion of the book of Acts, we can discern roughly two groups of Jewish Christians, the Nazarenes and the Ebionites. According to the accounts of church historians like Eusebius and Epiphanius, the Nazarenes were the immediate successors of the apostolic movement in the city of Jerusalem. It would behoove any Christian then, at least those interested in wading through the fog of early Christian doctrine, to consider their theology. According to the reports we have, the Nazarenes acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah, affirmed his miraculous birth by the Virgin Mary, and far from considering Christ to be the one true God himself, declared that God is one and that his Son is Jesus Christ. They evidently did accept this title, Son of God, but they did not understand it in the same way that later Nicene or Chalcedonian Orthodoxy would. The Messiah was, to them, a uniquely born and empowered human being, the prophesied seed of David. Scholars both ancient and modern have distinguished the Nazarenes from the so-called Ebionites, who appear to represent a closely related offshoot. Some of these Ebionites evidently doubted the virgin birth. However, it is certain that unlike probably half of the Ebionites, the Nazarenes accepted the virgin birth, and ultimately both the Nazarenes and the Ebionites reject Jesus' pre-existence and deity. In this, we appear to already locate historical grounds for our own claims that the earliest Jewish Jesus community, the one described in the book of Acts and headquartered in Jerusalem, held to the Christological beliefs of modern-day biblical Unitarians. And perhaps, equally surprising, is the evidence that these Jewish groups even persisted into the 4th century. But how is this possible? Just before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, church historians tell us that the Nazarene Christians escaped Jerusalem and they fled to Pella in modern Jordan, where they continued to operate for many years. However, it appears that a few hundred years later, after Nicaea laid down the affirmation of the deity and pre-existence of Jesus as the requirement for legal Christian confession, the Nazarenes tragically dissolved in isolation. They were evidently unwilling to admit Christ into the Godhead and were equally unable to rejoin their synagogues due to their belief in Jesus as the Messiah. Reports of Ebionites persist until around the middle of the 5th century, though some vague reports of them probably resurface around the 11th. However, even though their tribulations suppressed the spread of their Jewish community, the spirit of the Jewish Christians' human Christology and their rejection of pre-existence did continue on in many Gentile Christian teachers. Of course, the 4th century Photinus is one such figure. But even among the Gentile Christians who were often more disposed to philosophical, even Platonic ways of thinking, there was still no great belief in a co-equal Trinity. May we never, ever forget this fact. Indeed, what we might call subordinationism was the order of the day until the curtains finally fell on the 4th century. As Bishop R.P.C. Hansen reveals, with the exception of Athanasius, virtually every theologian, East and West, accepted some form of subordinationism, at least up to the year 355. Subordinationism might indeed, until the denouement of the controversy, have been described as accepted orthodoxy. But beyond a basic Unitarian subordinationism prevailing until the 4th century, we have record that the specific views of the Jewish Christians, that is, the human Christology with no pre-existence, lived also among the Gentiles. Around 100 to 150, Justin Martyr, who was himself a Unitarian, but one who believed in pre-existence, he attests that there were indeed other Gentile Christians in his day who did not believe in the Messiah's pre-existence, agreeing with the Jewish messianic expectation. In this period, just how many Gentile Christians believed in pre-existence and just how many did not is just too difficult to say. In 190, the teacher Theodotus held to a purely human Christology without pre-existence, and many historians, even ancient historians, believe that he also believed in the virgin birth. And his movement would continue on with many students and teachers who followed in his wake as the sect of the Theodosians into the 3rd century. And also in the 3rd century, we have Artemon around 230. He was a popular teacher in Rome. He was still teaching the human Christology. He said that Jesus was born of a virgin but did not pre-exist. And he furthermore publicly claimed to be beholden to the oldest traditions of the apostles, which evidently frustrated his opponents. Interestingly, as Hansen attested, even among the overtly Platonizing Christians who did believe in the pre-existence of Jesus, again, there was still a persisting Unitarianism and subordinationism. The claim that Arius had made in the 4th century, which had landed him in trouble with his bishop, saying there was a time when the Son was not, can also be found on the lips of scholars like Tertullian in the previous century. Tertullian, who is often today wrongly labeled an Orthodox Trinitarian, he also wrote that there was a time when the Son did not exist in his work against Hermogenes. Tertullian and many other famous Gentile theologians of the church had indeed subordinated the Son to the Father. So there was, after all, a great deal of history on Arius' side regarding his basic proposal that the Son was not eternal and that he was subordinate to God the Father. His claims that he was only holding to traditional Christian doctrines proves correct. This fact of history, that Unitarianism goes all the way back to the beginning of Christianity and is so widely attested, this is often very surprising to evangelical and Catholic Christians who have been taught that all real Christians have always believed in a co-equal Trinity. But even the most rudimentary survey of Christian history swiftly dispels that myth. And a closer look proves even more surprising than this. Indeed, as we have seen, not only has Unitarian subordinationism preceded Arius and indeed stretched back as far as Christian history goes, so too does the belief that Jesus did not literally pre-exist his birth. And as biblical Unitarians, this is our doctrine. And this belief is clearly found surviving during and even through the 4th century, as even after the troublesome Council of Nicaea. And this is evident in the teaching of our main subject today, Photinus of Galatia. So, having now introduced the history of Unitarianism in the first few centuries of the church, we now have sufficient background with which to engage Photinus' life and teachings. Okay, Photinus of Galatia. The man was born in Ankara in modern-day Turkey. Today, this is Turkey's capital and the second largest city after Istanbul. And even in ancient times, Ankara was the capital of the Roman province of Galatia, which you've doubtless all heard of due to Paul's mission there. Photinus is mentioned by many ancient writers, including, but not limited to, Ambrosiaster, Hilary, Socrates, Sozomen, Ambrose, Cassian, Severus, Jerome, Vigilius, and many more. This speaks, I believe, to the noteworthiness of his presence in the 4th century. In fact, the few scholars who are interested in this subject today have begun to rewrite our portrait of 4th century controversy to include Photinus and the Photinians as among its main players. Far from an insignificant minority position with no power at all, scholars like D.H. Williams at Baylor have now argued that Photinus actually forced a sustained theological confrontation within the Catholic Church. Photinus' views had been taken as a serious threat to Nicene orthodoxy in the 4th century. And soon we will consider even more evidence that Photinus' impact on Christology in the Roman Empire indeed lasted long after his death. Photinus' name means man of light. However, his theological enemies would come to name him Scotinus, the man of darkness. Like most Unitarians after the 2nd century, by virtue of his existence, we could say he had a knack for cultivating enemies. And the life of Photinus would come to be, as we will discover, one wrought with conflict. But his war was likely a defensive one. If he sallied forth to meet his foes, it was probably in the name of survival, for a right to life. As we will see, he ultimately found little favor among the emperors, or the Christian ones anyway, and even less favor among the many bishops who came knocking at his door to accuse him. This was the nature of his struggle. The light of the man of light required constant guarding from the many winds of a dangerous new world which threatened to snuff it out. Notice of the character of Photinus we have preserved for us by several authors. Epiphanius says that Photinus had a fluent way of speaking. Sozomen says that he was naturally eloquent and persuasive, and he gained many to his opinions. Vincent says that he was applauded by the people, was a man of ready wit, extensive learning, and charming eloquence, which to these Orthodox historians were evidently dangerous qualities which must have tempted away many people to his views. Several historians tell us that Photinus spoke and wrote exquisitely in both Latin and Greek, and we might guess that his theological books, being well written, likely extended his doctrine's appeal long after his death. Photinus appears to have argued for his Christology in a similar manner that we do today. He had favorite scripture texts, which he employed regularly to prove his points, according to Bishop Hilary. These included 1 Timothy 2:5, John 8:40, and 1 Corinthians 15:47. And Epiphanius says that Photinus proudly boasted about his doctrine's ability to be supported by innumerable scripture passages. Epiphanius also tells us that regarding John's prologue, Photinus held that the Logos in John 1 was eternal, but that the Logos was not the Son. And with his use of Scripture, and possibly with his interpretation of the prologue, we will all doubtless identify. As I've said, Photinus held to our basic positions as biblical Unitarians, that God is one, that he is the Father of Jesus, that Jesus is the Son of God who was born of a virgin but did not pre-exist his birth. But our next historical question is, where exactly did Photinus learn his doctrine? Okay, Photinus and Marcellus. The early life of Photinus is shrouded in mystery, but we do know that he served under Marcellus of Ankara, who died in 375. In the last 40 years, much has actually come to light about Marcellus, and further studies about him are even now shedding light on the Council of Nicaea itself, and are suggesting that Marcellus' theology may have played a much larger role at Nicaea than previously thought. Marcellus was an anti-Arian. He hated Arius, and he was a supporter of Nicaea, or of what Nicaea had at one point meant to him. But later, he was also himself on the receiving end of deposition by subsequent church councils. Marcellus was indeed accused of being a monarchian. Monarchians were Christians who didn't agree with the popular Logos theory. Instead, monarchians would have said that the Logos was not a second being, but that it was a mode or a property of the one God. In essence, Marcellus held to a modalist type of theology. His Jesus was the one God himself. In the end, however, it is possible that Marcellus grew tired of the theological trouble that he was often in. And after council condemned Marcellus, he was likely rather worn down. It is even possible that he ultimately began to trend in a different direction, away from his older, more controversial teachings. Hansen writes that whatever Marcellus was teaching, quote, his vicissitudes caused him to temper the edge of his doctrine and take account of the criticisms of his friends as well as his enemies, end quote. Regardless, after his deposition, Marcellus never again regained his seat at Ancyra after his banishment in 336. A man named Basil had taken his place there as master of the city, and Marcellus went to wander between Rome and Constantinople, the two capitals of the Roman Empire. But in the wake of this community turmoil in Ancyra, what of young Photinus, who had served under Marcellus as deacon? During this time, we can guess that Photinus must have served his community in Ancyra faithfully and came to be well regarded. However, we might also suppose that it was around this time that Photinus must have come into his own theologically. Perhaps he was able to achieve this now that he was out from under the supervision of his expelled master, or perhaps he had already begun to move in his own direction even under Marcellus' tutelage. It is impossible to say for sure. But it is evident that Photinus ultimately did receive great support from the public for his important and unique teaching. Having spent time serving in Ancyra, Photinus' popularity eventually permitted him to be elected as bishop to an important post in another city. The Council of Sardica in 343 appointed him as bishop of Sirmium, which was one of the largest cities of its time. Sirmium was in fact considered one of the 4 centers or capitals of the Roman Empire. 10 Roman emperors were born in that city, and it was also home to an impressive imperial palace. The great Roman historian Marcellinus called it the glorious mother of cities. And in Photinus' day, it had already become an important center for Christianity. At least 5 major councils of the church took place there. Ultimately, there can be no doubt of the significance of Photinus' post and of the significance of his appointment there. Today, many will be surprised that a theologian teaching the things that Photinus was could have ever come to such a place of prominence. And so our next question naturally becomes, what exactly did Photinus ultimately come to teach, and how was it different from his old master, Marcellus? Since his works are now lost to us, we are forced to piece his theology together through the accounts of biased and sometimes confused historians, as well as probably confused sets of anathemas made against him, which are often the opposite of helpful. Hansen believes that Photinus' doctrine may have been a moderated form of what we might call middle Marcellism, that is, what Marcellus once taught before his critics curbed his teaching. Thus, some have thought Photinus to tend towards a more modalist type of theology. But, as D.H. Williams has recently observed, quote, Hansen's assertion that Photinus was a doctrinaire disciple of Marcellus is an exaggeration of what little we do know about the two, end quote. New light has now begun to be shed on the relationship between Marcellus and Photinus doctrines due to a fragment we have recovered from Hilary, who suggests that Marcellus had formulated the basis on which Photinus realized his position. Indeed, one thing seems clear. Whatever the doctrine of Marcellus, Photinus took the principles of that doctrine further than his old teacher ever had. Hansen does describe Photinus' teaching as, quote, a determinedly monotheist Christian doctrine of God. And shouldn't that be what we all strive for? A monotheist Christian doctrine of God? Could a Christian doctrine of God ever be too monotheistic, I wonder? When I first read that quotation from Hansen, I thought to myself, would Photinus' opponents then have less determinedly monotheistic Christian doctrines of God? Regardless, Photinus achieved his strict monotheism, as we have seen, by forbidding the personal and eternal preexistence of the Son. Photinus understood that once such doctrines are permitted, the integrity of the Godhead is threatened. He evidently regularly appealed to Isaiah 44:6 in his debates, I am God and there is no other, to strengthen his denial of any hypostatic distinction between the Father, the Logos, and the Spirit. There was no distinct person of God the Son or person of God the Spirit. The Logos and the Spirit, for Photinus, were one and the same, and they were both God's power. Thus, Photinus avoided every doctrine which led to distinctions in the being of God. What's most interesting to me is that the ancient authors accuse Photinus of, quote, reviving the heresy of the Ebionites. We recall from our earlier survey that the Ebionites of Jerusalem were among the earliest Jewish Christians of the first century. Because of this identification of Photinus with the Ebionites, some have thought to class Photinus as an adoptionist, as someone who denied the virgin birth. But again, the lines between the Nazarenes who accepted the virgin birth and the Ebionites, most of whom probably did not, are sometimes difficult to distinguish in ancient histories. For the later Orthodox historians who wrote against Photinus and sought to discredit him, understandably little care was given in accurately classing him among the ranks of heretics. But Nathaniel Lardner, in his history, offers a helpful comment here. He writes that, quote, they who said Photinus aimed to revive the heresy of Ebion might mean no more than that he was a Unitarian after the manner of the Jews, end quote. And this is most likely the case. For in any instance, the Jewish Christians to which the heresiologists referred denied the personal preexistence of Christ and assigned to Jesus an unqualified humanity. And ultimately, though virtually every ancient historian accuses Photinus of making Jesus a mere man, all but one refrains from accusing him of denying the virgin birth. Certainly, the earlier rejection of pre-existence found in the Jewish Christians was carried on by him. One 4th century theologian named Lucifer, perhaps appropriately, says this. He says, Photinus professes that the Son of God was only a man. He says that before the Virgin Mary, he did not exist. That's his big complaint there. Alongside this, the historians say that Photinus taught that the alleged Christophanies in the Old Testament, the appearances of the so-called angel of the Lord, which many took to be the Son, he says these were appearances of the Father only. He wrote that when the Old Testament did speak of a son, as in Daniel 7:13, that this was prophetic language only, that the Son did not actually yet exist. Indeed, Photinus said that Christ did not exist before Adam, but Adam before Christ. The so-called heavenly language about Jesus descending and being sent from God in the Gospel of John referred not to the personality of the Son, but rather to his teachings. Jesus was the messenger, the teacher sent by God. Thus, he was sent down from heaven. Photinus further taught that the union of Logos and Christ, which occurred at his birth, was one of inspiration and purpose only. Jesus was a man, miraculously conceived, but a human being empowered and moved by God dwelling in him. And we have record that for Photinus, the idea of God himself entering the womb was evidently to Photinus both impossible and unscriptural. The Nicene Bishop Hilary spoke of those who held to Photinus' doctrine as being in error because they said that if Christ was man, then he could not also be God. Hilary writes that Photinus and those like him concluded that after his birth, Jesus acquired God's wisdom and power rather than being born as that wisdom and power. He was not God's wisdom and power by nature, rather he acquired and grew in that power. To support his Christological claims, Bishop Ambrose tells us about Photinus' two most favorite texts. 1 Timothy 2:5, which says, "There is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus." And John 8:40, which says, "You seek to kill me, a man who has spoken the truth that I heard from God." Perhaps it was Photinus' proud reliance on the scriptures that contributed to his popularity among the people. Indeed, all of Photinus' teaching, despite and probably because of its popularity, ultimately attracted the notice of the Eusebians. There we go. The Eusebians is a name that we can give to what appears to be the mainstream of 4th century theologians in the East. They wouldn't call themselves Arians, they disliked Arius, but they are essentially subordinationists who also believed in the pre-existence of the Son as the Logos, and who held to Origen's mysterious eternal generation of the Son accomplished by God's will. They do not hold the Son to be the same substance as the Father, and they avoided the controversial word homoousios used at Nicaea. So with all of this in mind, it's easy to see why this majority of Eastern theologians did not approve of Photinus, who said that the Son did not pre-exist. And since both parties are subordinationist, it appears that pre-existence was the main occasion for their Christological dispute. And so in 345, the Eusebians at Antioch attacked Photinus, evidently for denying pre-existence. They tried to excommunicate him, but somehow, against all odds, he remained in office after a dramatic outbreak of support from the populace. Then, 2 years later, in 347, he was attacked again by the Eusebians at the Council of Milan. They tried to excommunicate him, but he remained in office. And in 349, he was attacked again by another even larger council, which decreed his deposition from his bishopric. We don't know where this synod met, but Hilary puts it at Sirmium, being the first of the three councils there in 349. But apparently, because the Emperor Constantius, who was an Arian who believed in pre-existence, because Constantius was not present in the council when the decrees were made against Photinus, they still failed to dislodge him from his bishopric despite the size of the synod. There was evidently further outbreak of support, and he stayed in good stead with the people. At this point, the ancient church historian Socrates tells us that Photinus would never disclaim his avowed opinions, no matter what plans were hatched against him. And he was evidently in good company, which likely made things somewhat easier, perhaps speaking to the power of the Photinian movement. Because despite the force of Sirmium, Photinus stayed in possession of his bishopric for yet a few more years until 351, when the emperor himself finally ordered yet another council to be gathered there. Thus, in 351, at another council of Sirmium, the political tides finally overcame the man of light. From the anathemas pronounced against him at Sirmium, we learn that Photinus had said that the Son pre-existed only according to the divine foreknowledge. One anathema directed at him says, quote, "If anyone interprets the words of Isaiah, 'I am the first and I am the last, and besides me there is no God,' after the Jewish manner, as denying the only begotten God, who was before all ages, let him be anathema." Isn't that interesting? After the Jewish manner. And another anathema reveals that Photinus also said that the Son did not appear to Abraham. That was his argument. He furthermore had said that Genesis 19:24, the Lord rained fire from the Lord, did not refer to the Father speaking to the Son. And this evidently enraged the bishops at Sirmium. Thus the bishops gathered all these teachings of his, as well as the teachings of his old master Marcellus and others, and condemned them in a formula which they compelled Photinus to sign or be exiled. Their demands of him that he should renounce his errors went unfulfilled, of course. But this time, Photinus complained to the emperor that he was not engaged in a fair fight, that he was suffering injustice. Photinus asked the emperor if he could be allowed to debate his enemies in Constantius' presence, in a contest moderated by judges whom the emperor could appoint. And the emperor actually granted his request. And the emperor chose 6 Roman senators as the judges. Scribes were employed to record the proceedings of that meeting, and they made 3 copies of it, which are all tragically lost to us. The semi-Arian Basil, who defended pre-existence and divinity for Jesus, was chosen as Photinus' opponent. Again, this Basil was the successor of Photinus' old master Marcellus at Ancyra. We know that the debate between Photinus and Basil was long and arduous. Despite Photinus' eloquence and persuasiveness, Basil's side, which just so happened to be the side of the emperor, prevailed. The verdict was in. Photinus was to be exiled. Thus Basil took him by his hand, and he was put out of his see at once. As I mentioned, we have no record of this debate preserved for us. What sort of arguments could we have heard in it, I wonder? What more could we have learned about our faith in the 4th century? But wonder is, unfortunately, all we can do. Now, years later, many scholars actually believe that Photinus managed to regain his see under the Emperor Julian for a short time. Julian is very interesting. Julian was a pagan emperor. He was a shocking interruption to the recent string of Christian emperors. Julian wore the philosopher's beard. He worked earnestly for the revival of paganism, for the traditions of the old fathers. He made trouble for the many Christians, and he personally authored philosophical treatises against Christian doctrines. With the Christian idea of the incarnation, Julian was especially displeased. And so he found an unlikely ally in the Christian Photinus. In 362, Photinus received an approving letter from Emperor Julian, who praised him for denying the incarnation. Put it up here for us, if you can read that. He says, "O Photinus, you at any rate seem to maintain what is probably true, and come nearest to being saved, and do well to believe that he whom one holds to be a god can by no means be brought into the womb. But Diodorus, a charlatan priest of the Nazarene, when he tries to give point to that nonsensical theory about the womb by artifices and jugglers' tricks, is clearly a sharp-witted sophist of that creed of the country folk." Didn't they insult each other with such eloquence back then? The Orthodox Ambrose comments on this point. He says that Photinus, because he did not regard Christ as God on the grounds that he was born, Photinus appears wise to the worldly. And in this, Photinus does seem wise indeed, but not to the worldly only, but also to those who carry on his dedication to the truth of the Scriptures and to the one God of the Scriptures, beside whom there is no other God. Other documents mentioning Photinus include another letter sent from Pope Liberius of Rome, which listed a Photinus among several Macedonian bishops about 365. But in my opinion, this was probably a different Photinus. Regardless, though Photinus of Galatia had regained his see under Julian, according to Jerome, Photinus was evidently put out of power under the Emperor Valentinian I once again, but this time to return no more. Even in exile, however, Photinus continued to write many theological books. Could these have been his greatest writings? The refined works of an older man tried by life, his doctrines tested by the fire of debate. What did they say, I often wonder. Alas, we have only the example of Photinus' life to learn from, and perhaps that is enough for us. Photinus' death is dated to 366, but the light of Photinus' influence evidently lived on. In the East, his doctrine appears to have had little impact, but in the West, particularly on the Balkan Peninsula, Photinians continued on. They are still known at Sirmium in 381. And at this time, the law had now been laid down by Emperor Theodosius, which established the Trinity doctrine, which outlawed Unitarianism and everything else. In the edict proclaimed by this emperor in 381, religious freedom was given to other Christian sects to gather together, but an exception was made for the Photinians specifically and a few other groups. Their Unitarianism and human Christology were an affront to the newly codified Trinity dogma and would not be tolerated. But the Photinians evidently still met in Sirmium in spite of the law. The faith of the Photinians was indeed difficult to stop. As Lucifer of Cagliari observed of Photinus, he says, "You've devoted written text and established preachers in every place who are favorable to your views." By the time of Augustine, who died in 430, anyone who considered Christ to be a mere man was called a Photinian. So we see that the doctrine persisted even in the 5th century, and of course, as we know, far beyond it. Indeed, the other records of the Photinians can be located in the beginning of the 5th century, in which we find that a Photinian named Marcus, who was driven from Rome, found refuge in the church at Dalmatia. Another man, Gennadius of Marseille, tells us about a Spanish bishop who wrote against Photinians in 360, and from this account we also learn that the Photinians in the area of Spain were sometimes known as the Bonosians, after a Unitarian teacher called Bonosus. But exactly where the lines between the Unitarian groups fall is now difficult to distinguish. Some have speculated that the Unitarian views of the Photinians and the Bonosians in Spain eventually contributed to influences on the Spaniard Michael Servetus during the Reformation. And from there, of course, we know very well the colorful history and story of the Unitarian Christian faith. And it is true that the light offered by the man of light, the light of Unitarianism, still shines today. But now we are the privileged custodians of it. What will we do with it? Where will we all go from here? Will our light shine on if we too are condemned to exile like Photinus? Looking around at our dark times progressively makes persecution less unimaginable. And ultimately, when we are gone from this life, it is incumbent upon us to ask, what will our own legacy look like? Will it be one of going along with the crowd and swallowing the same sterilized history? Or will it be one of shining a light in dark corners, no matter the cost? The reality of our situation is this: Christendom at large exhibits today only a compromised sense of history. What it knows about where and how it got its central creeds and confessions, it has learned through a consistently prejudiced lens. And it is evident that most Christians today are either unaware or worse, uninterested in clarifying that historical vision. But these things cannot continue to be so. It is indeed up to us, as not only custodians of the faith, but custodians of the history of the faithful, to lend ourselves to the shedding of light on the deliberately obscured ancient world which ultimately produced our modern one. The problems we have in church today did not begin today. But it is today that the process of their undoing can begin, if only we can realize and dedicate ourselves to the task. Without question, we should take advantage of the religious freedom we have today, as the Emperor Julians of our own time have afforded us with a unique opportunity. We can now work and write and teach with the expectation that the work that we do will live on to continue to help others after our time. But even if it does not, even if the government one day silences us, as it did Photinus and the Photinians, it is in Photinus that we have the hope that at least the light of our lives will burn on and on, waiting for the next generation of Christians to rediscover that light and be inspired to both faith and action. Thank you very much.